30 years, abolitionists had tried to place slavery on the road to extinction. By the 1850s, it appeared the use of moral suasion was not working. So new means of achieving their goals were adopted. Anti-slavery crowds sought to prevent slave catchers from transporting fugitives back to the South. William Lloyd Garrison re-emphasized the doctrine of disunion. The North should secede from the South. Black abolitionist Martin Delany advanced his immigration argument in his manifesto, Political Destiny of the Colored Race on the American Continent. Political institutions failed to block slavery's expansion. Bleeding Kansas had revealed that popular sovereignty, Congress, and the President could not find a solution to the problem of slavery in the Western territories. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision eliminated possible compromise solutions to the Western question. The intensity of the invective between North and South continued to grow. How would the nation deal with this growing divide over the institution of slavery? How would the United States survive these expanding fault lines? It was in this context that John Brown walked onto the historical stage. On October 16th, 1859, Brown and 21 other men, 17 white, 2 free blacks, 3 fugitive black slaves, and 2 local enslaved persons, set out to initiate a slave rebellion within the southern states. Their first target was the United States Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's now in West Virginia. He and his men initially captured the armory, but his one fatal mistake was to allow the eastbound Baltimore and Ohio train from Wheeling to pass through the town. And this provided the conductor with an opportunity to telegraph authorities when the train arrived to the first station with a working telegraph line. Brown's men had cut a number of lines. After the call went out for assistance, Colonel Robert E. Lee ordered a company of U.S. Marines under the command of First Lieutenant Israel Green to storm the engine house where Brown and his men and some hostages had taken refuge. The engine house was quickly overtaken. 5 of Brown's party escaped, 10 were killed, and 7 were captured, including Brown. On December 2nd, Brown was hanged. Over the next 4 months, the 6 others were also hanged. John Brown's last note was handed to his jailer, Captain John Avis. It read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." Brown became a lightning rod. On December 14th, 1859, in the United States Senate, Benjamin F. Wade of Ohio said, quote, "Do not jump to the conclusion that the people who hold meetings in the North in admiration of the personal qualities of John Brown, one single man of them, stand forth to justify his nefarious and unwarranted act, end quote. One day later, in the House of Representatives, M.J. Crawford of Georgia warned that Northern rhetoric which condemned Brown's action did not assuage Southerners. Crawford continued, quote, "When we see that the North proposes to repeal her personal liberty bills and her acts of habeas corpus, when she throws upon her jails for the security of our fugitive slaves, when we can travel through northern states as brethren, and you can travel south without attempting to excite insurrection, when our rights in the territories are respected, then, and not until then, will the South be satisfied. But until then, your Union meetings amount to nothing. Give us these things, and then we will begin to listen to what you have to say." End quote. After Brown's execution, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "John Brown will make the gallows as glorious as the cross." Nathaniel Hawthorne said regarding Brown, "Nobody was ever more justly hanged." Hi, I'm Tom Army, and this is part 10 of U.S. History's online series, Causes of the Civil War. Traditionally known as John Brown's Raid, although a month after the attack, a Baltimore newspaper listed words such as insurrection, rebellion, and crusade to describe it. The events at Harper's Ferry have raised lingering questions about Brown's character. Was he misguided? Or was he a hero? Was he wild and insane? Are these pointless arguments? Perhaps. In this episode, we will investigate a different set of questions. What motivated Brown to become an abolitionist? How did his religious background affect his ideas? Why did he turn to violence? And finally, what was Brown's impact on the coming of the Civil War? John Brown was a deeply religious man in the tradition of Calvinism, which emphasized the deep depravity of human beings. He was, unlike most abolitionists who came out of the revivals of the Second Great Awakening and embraced a more optimistic view of the human condition, Brown read the Old Testament. He worshiped a vengeful, angry God. He believed that punishment was necessary for redemption. For example, he kept a ledger to record the lashes he inflicted on his children for their transgressions. To provide for his family of 20 children, he tried a number of business ventures, but all failed. By the early 1840s, he was bankrupt. He lost 4 children to dysentery, was separated from his family months at a time as he looked for work. And he started to grow agitated over the idea that the slave power had seized control of the federal government. In 1843, black abolitionist Henry Highland Garnett delivered a speech at an African American convention where he called on slaves to rebel. William Lloyd Garrison thought the speech too dangerous and consequently would not publish it. Brown paid for both the publication of the speech and he paid for copies of David Walker's appeal. Finally, the Kansas-Nebraska Act pushed Brown to believe that moral suasion would not bring about abolition. Only violence would. One day after the sack of the Free State town of Lawrence, Kansas on May 21st, 1856, where only one person was wounded, Brown learned that Preston Brooks had beaten Charles Sumner to an inch of his life. Brown decided to act. He and his 4 sons and 3 other men dragged 5 unarmed men and boys from their homes along Kansas's Pottawatomie Creek and hacked and dismembered their bodies. Brown then traveled to Boston, where he sought and received financial support for his rebellion from a group later called the Secret Six. In October 1859, Brown attacked Harper's Ferry. What was his aim? Was he an intentional martyr? At his trial, he gave the impression that his goal was to liberate the oppressed. After his death, a few in the North proclaimed him a hero. Others distanced themselves from him. Still others tried to split the difference. On February 27, 1860, Abraham Lincoln delivered his brilliant Cooper's Union address in New York City. Lincoln had his eye on the Republican Party nomination for president. John Brown, he said, was no Republican. But Lincoln did not repudiate Brown's ideals. Many Southerners started to see the Republicans as the abolitionist party, and thanks to Brown, as a militant party. Brown's legacy was that he hastened the coming of the Civil War. But the war was not yet inevitable. John C. Calhoun's warning that the South's way of life was under siege now became a mainstream opinion. So what would push the country permanently apart? M.J. Crawford of Georgia had this to say to his colleagues on the floor of the House of Representatives. Now, in regard to the election of a black Republican president, I have this to say, and I speak the sentiment of every Democrat on this floor from the state of Georgia. We will never submit to the inauguration of a black Republican president. The 1860 presidential election was only 9 months away.